That's something that would go on in my family.
Did you take a new job? Where? Idlewild? Okay, where? Okay. Mhm. Congratulations. Okay, good afternoon or evening, everyone. Nice to see you again. 2 weeks in a row for me. This side is a lot more people. It's like services. Everyone has their favorite seat that they sit in. Let's get started with yes, indeed, the bracha, the blessing over Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, creator of the universe, who sanctified us with the mitzvot and instructed us to study words of Torah. There's no one on Zoom at this point, but I'm going to try to stay in front of this anyway because it's recorded. I believe Rabbi Kornsgold sent out an email this morning that I was switching the chapter we're going to do. We're going back to chapter 9 today, because as I was preparing for the one we were going to do, because we skipped this one before Passover, and it doesn't make sense to go out of order on this particular topic. Did I see Jennifer Koss walking in before? She did. Okay. So we're going to look in chapter 9 at what's called the Rabbinic Revolution. And while I might be a rabbi, all of you, whether you know it or not, are rabbinic Jews. And we're going to get to exactly what that means. Hello, Jennifer. Give you a handout. But let's start with this question. If you had to think about where Judaism started, what moment did Judaism start? Or what time period did Judaism start in? What would you come up with? Funny? All right, that's an obvious guess. We could say the time of Abraham in the stories in the Torah, because we say Abraham was the first Jewish person, the first person to believe in one God. Okay, that's a possibility. What do you think about it? Okay, so you go even back to Adam. Okay. Any other possibilities? When did Judaism start? We have Adam, we have Abraham, we got all the A's covered. That's a very good question. Well, now we know who did the reading. Now we know who did the reading. So that's why it's called the Rabbinic Revolution. So Adam and Abraham are characters in the Torah. And I believe in an earlier chapter you learned a little bit about Jewish history from biblical times. Adam is recorded in the Torah as the very first person, Adam and Eve. Most of us don't believe this part of it particularly literally, but that's what we say in tradition. Abraham, 20 generations after Adam, is the first person to have pretty exclusive relationship with God, the entity, the being that we refer to as God, in Hebrew, Yud, He, Vav, He, Adonai, as we might say, or Hashem in more religious circles. But they're still not the Jewish people. So what's another name for Jewish people in the Torah? Israelites. Okay, Israelites. Where does that name come from? The children of Israel. Who is Israel? Anyone know? Okay, so Israel is another name for Jacob, the third of the three patriarchs. So God enters into a covenant with Abraham, promising Abraham that his children are going to be this mighty nation and that God is going to be their God. And Jacob / Israel is the one who goes down to Egypt, who fathers the 12 tribes, or the children, the sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. And who leads them out of Israel? Who's the next person up? Moses, okay? So, so Moses leads the people out of Egypt, leads them to Mount Sinai, where they enter into formal covenant with God, where they receive the Ten Commandments, where they receive the Torah. They travel for 40 years across the desert. At the end of 40 years, they wind up where? Land of Israel. They settle in the land of Israel. So, if I understood the lesson correctly, last time you studied how during biblical times the Israelites, the 12 tribes, spread out in the land of Israel, how they kind of divided themselves up into two kingdoms eventually, and then how in the year 586 before the Common Era, the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. Is that where about the last lesson ended? So we covered a lot of Jewish history in about 2.5 minutes right there, but that's a very brief review to get you up to where we are. Now, hello, come on in. So even though the Jews lived in the land of Israel, even though they had that first temple that was initially built by King Solomon, they weren't Jews the way we are. They didn't practice Judaism the way we do. There you go. So we're going to look at the period of time after the destruction of the first temple and what happened after that time that took that group of people, Israelites, and turned them into Jews, into practicing a religion closer, much closer to what we practice today. And that period of time is generally known as the rabbinic period. So flip to page 128 in your books, and there's a timeline here. So Jewish people are exiled to Babylonia in 586 under the king Nebuchadnezzar. And if you know anything about ancient Near Eastern history, there are a whole stream of empires that all take each other over, take their turns being the dominant one. And the land of Israel is just this little sliver of land. We tend to think of ourselves as very important. We always center ourselves in our own stories because that's what people do. But when you look at the region, we were kind of a small part of many other people's stories as well. And the Babylonians were one of those people. Well, the Babylonian Empire falls shortly, about 30 years after destroying the temple, in about 538 before the Common Era, and they fall to King Cyrus II of Persia. The Persian Empire is ascendant. And it's during the Persian period when the Jews are now, the exiled Jews are now under the rule of Persians, that their luck begins to change. First of all, anyone know what famous Jewish story takes place in the Persian Empire? Purim story, the story of Esther and Mordecai takes place during the Persian period. Mordecai is perceived as a leader of the Jewish community in Persia. So that story takes place between the two temples. Now, the Persians have a very different attitude towards the people they conquer than the Babylonians. The Babylonians believed in exiling people. They believed in totally subjecting them. They believed in destroying any kind of national identity that they had on their own and making them subservient to their particular empire. The Persians, on the other hand, thought that happy subjects were good subjects. Happy subjects pay taxes. Happy subjects support whatever the emperor wants to do. So the Persians, under Cyrus and then Darius, start to allow the Jewish people to return from Babylonia to the land of Israel. And they come back very slowly. And there were Jews who had stayed in the land, who had not been exiled. And so there's some conflicts that arise between the Jews who stayed through the exile period and the Jews who are coming back. And it's roughly during this period that the second temple in Jerusalem is built on the same spot as the first temple, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the spot where the mosque is now. Jews start to rebuild it under several different Jewish leaders, one of them being Ezra, who's listed here in the timeline. And Ezra is also believed to be the person who canonized the Torah. What does it mean to canonize? Close, okay? So Ezra, who established which books go and counted as the Hebrew Bible or as the Jewish Bible. So the Jews are returning. They're rebuilding this land with some amount of independence under the Persians. Ultimately, they're still good subjects to the Persians. They pay their taxes and they're allowed to do their own thing. The temple is rebuilt. It's probably a very small place, actually. When we picture the second temple in Jerusalem, we picture this grand, gigantic building with lots of gold everywhere. This is probably a very humble little local shrine, but it's going to get a lot bigger soon. So then Persians allow the Jews to come back to rebuild the temple, and then the Persians fall to Alexander the Great. People familiar with him from history? So you said he was Greek? Alexander the Greek. I believe also Alexander the Macedonian. He controls at this point in time the largest empire in the world, the largest empire of any of these. But when he dies, there is no one who can take over his gigantic empire. There's no one who can take over who can really accomplish what he accomplished. And actually, one side point, there's a legend that Alexander the Great was very good to the Jews who lived underneath him. And that's why there was a tradition of actually using the name Alexander as a Hebrew name. So less common today, but probably a generation or two ago, there were more Alexanders as a Hebrew name. And the legend, whether or not it's true, is that they were named after Alexander the Great, which is a long time to go with a name. So now we're into the Second Temple period, and Alexander's empire, he takes it apart before his death. He subdivides it, or it divides after his death, into several different smaller empires. Among them are the Ptolemies in Egypt, or one empire, and the Syrian Greeks. Where do we know the Syrian Greeks from? You're laughing. We know the Syrian Greeks from Hanukkah. So the Syrian Greeks are, their most famous ruler from our perspective is Antiochus. And the land of Israel is passed around between these different empires, these different rulers, all take their turns battling it out and controlling this little piece of land that the Jews are living in. We're there again. We're going about our own business, worshiping our God, using our temple, and paying our taxes. And that lasts until about the story of Hanukkah, which we mentioned with the king Antiochus, because he is the first ruler in several generations or in several empires to really step in and try to force his will on the people living in the land of Israel, on the pre-Jewish people, Jewish people. We studied. Did you have a lesson on the Hanukkah story? Guess not. Okay. So, but familiar with the Hanukkah story is that the Syrian Greeks put in a series of laws, of rules restricting Jewish practice in the land of Israel, taking over the temple, turning it into a pagan shrine, putting idols in the temple, and not allowing Jews to practice their religion. And they're opposed by a small group of rebels called the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, who win this incredible victory against the Syrian Greeks. They're incredibly outnumbered, but they're able to take back Jerusalem and rededicate the temple. That's what Hanukkah is, the rededication of the temple and the relighting of the menorah. And the Maccabees establish a semi-autonomous Jewish state in the land there. So we're already getting the picture of a region that is very warlike, where whoever's in charge, whoever's on top, is constantly changing. Now, in our version of the story of the of Hanukkah that we generally tell kids or tell anyone is that the Maccabees were heroes and they freed the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Well, actually, they just managed to annoy the Syrian Greeks enough that they said, okay, it's not worth continuing to fight. You do what you want to do. We're gonna back off, but you're still paying us taxes. Roughly, yes, roughly. In the yes, yes, I'm gonna go with yes on that one. Um, so the Maccabees have about 2 minutes of being the heroes because they're pretty lousy rulers and they can't stop fighting and killing each other. After Judah the Maccabee dies, his brothers take over, and each one of them is kind of worse than the one that came before. And after 2 or 3 generations, they're at civil war with each other. Different branches of the family are in, launching wars against each other to see who should control the land of Israel, who should be in charge, who should control the temple, thereby control the religion, and uh, and they're unable to reach any kind of arrangement until finally one Hasmonean invites the next big empire to come in. So the next big empire up is the Roman Empire. I'm going through a lot of sixth grade social studies here. Um, and is there anyone who's really knowledgeable about this time period? Okay, good. That's because I know it from about as much as from a Jewish history perspective. But if you ask me about each particular empire, like on a studying level, I would probably struggle with that. Um, so the Romans are actually invited in by the descendants of the Maccabees. They're basically given the land of Israel in exchange for supporting the claim of this particular Hasmonean. So the Romans come in, and like every other empire, they sometimes exert their authority, sometimes they leave the people alone to develop, to do what they're going to do. So far, I've talked about what's going on outside the land of Israel and the rulers who are not doing a great job of actually leading the people. In Israel itself, and in what we would call the Jewish world, there is not one Judaism and not really one Jewish people. Instead, this is a time that's characterized by sects, S-E-C-T-S, and different sects of Jews. And instead of, we think of Jews today as having denominations, conservative, reform, orthodox. So think about this as denominational differences, but really very different, almost completely different religions. They all base their origin story on the Torah, on the stories that we all share, but they each have a different way of going about and interpreting it. And some of these groups include people. First is the Pharisees. Anyone know the name of the Pharisees? Okay, if you were a churchgoer for much of Christian or Jewish history, the Pharisees are not particularly liked because they were the people who turned Jesus over to the Romans. But the Pharisees, their name means interpreters, and they were described as religious reformers. They tried to move Jewish practice away from being focused on the temple in Jerusalem and really started to focus on what we do in our homes, what we do in daily life. And because of that, you can already tell that those are going to be the group that we come from. As Jews, we descend from the Perushim, from the Pharisees. And what they teach during this time is the core of modern Judaism. The idea that religious life takes place with the individual wherever the community is, not necessarily in the one temple in Jerusalem. And they were the ancestors of the group that we call the rabbis. So the Pharisees slash the rabbis are one group. Another group, another sect, are the Sadducees, Sadducees. And the Sadducees were based in larger cities, especially Jerusalem, and they were based around the temple. A lot of them were priests, were kohanim, were the people who served in the temple. And because of that, they had a great stake in the temple being the dominant form of religion, because the priests were supported by the people. Basically, their success came because of these aristocratic, these inherited positions that many of them held. And so they didn't disagreed with interpretations of Judaism that the Pharisees were putting forward. Another group during this time, the Essenes, Essenes, Essenes. Jeopardy question. And I'm just going to read this one. According to Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, they were described as a group of ascetic and disciplined group of ancient hippies. So the Essenes lived out in the desert. They felt that everyone who lived in the big cities were corrupt, were up to no good, and they sat around in the desert in one particular area, Qumran. Is that a name that rings a bell for anyone? So what was discovered in Qumran? The Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are some of the oldest editions of Jewish holy books, probably came from this particular sect. Now they were they as part of being ascetic, they also did not believe in procreation, and so a group that lives out in the middle of the desert and does not procreate dies pretty quickly. Doesn't last more than a generation or two. So they did not have a very long history. Another group that could be described during this time, we generally call them the Zealots. And the Zealots, their cause was provoking war with Rome. They said, we're going to be free, we're going to be independent, we're going to reestablish a full Jewish state under our control, and we're going to launch wars against Rome. Now, again, much as I said with the Syrian Greeks, Israel is this tiny little country in the midst of a giant empire. When you picture the Roman Empire, you picture their legions coming forward. No group really stood a chance in Israel fighting against the Roman Empire. But the Zealots exist in every part of Judean society, especially in Jerusalem as well. This is the same group that later on was at Masada, the fortress that the Romans besieged, that ended with mass suicide when they realized that they were about to lose. And so they kind of existed between all of the groups, agitating against Rome. And finally, another group that starts in this time period would be called the Nazarenes, or could also be called the Christians. And they're described here as a Jewish sect that followed a charismatic messianic figure named Jesus of Nazareth, who was executed by Rome in 32 of the Common Era, likely one of the many messianic groups at the time. So this time period is actually the origin of Christianity, and Christianity starts as a sect of Judaism. The early Christians, the followers of Jesus during his life and after his death, were 100% part of the Jewish world. Like all of these other groups, fighting for adherence, fighting for their spot in the land of Israel. And by messianic, it means that they looked towards one figure who was going to be some sort of redeemer. And as I described this time period, there's a lot of war, there's a lot of upheaval, and during periods like that, people look for a Messiah. They look for the figure who's going to lead them forward, who's going to take them to a better place. So they're one of any number of groups that followed a messianic type figure. They're just the one that we know about because eventually they branch off into their own religion and become the world's largest religion in many different forms. But this is their beginning. So you have this kind of combustible situation in the land of Israel. All of these groups fighting for dominance, with Rome looking over everybody's shoulder. And the Zealots are agitating. Eventually they succeed in launching a war against Rome. And Surprisingly, at this time, Jews are pretty good at launching a war against Rome, launching a revolt, and it lasts several different years. It lasts for a number of years, from about 66 of the Common Era until 70 of the Common Era. And actually, I left out one important figure in this. Who knows the name Herod? Okay, so Herod the Great, or Herod the Wicked, or Herod the Terrible, was a quasi-Jewish emperor. He was an Idumean, that was another group in the region who had been forcefully converted to Judaism, not something we do today, but before the Common Era, the Roman Empire appointed him as their emperor or their king in the land of Israel. But what Herod is most known for is his building projects. And many of those building projects still stand in Israel today. Now, Herod built the second temple that we picture. Herod basically tore down the second temple. Really, you could say there were three temples, and reconstructed the top of the Temple Mount. And if you go there today, you'll see that the structure on top is a platform. There's a platform on the very top of the mountain that's supported by walls underneath it. The most famous of those walls being the Wailing Wall, or the Kotel, or the Western Wall, that held up the platform. On top of the platform was where Herod rebuilt this gigantic, glorious temple that is the way that we generally imagine the Second Temple looking. So, and he also built, I believe, the Tiberias, the city that you can visit today, and you can see a lot of archaeology focuses on Herod's work in Israel today. So he was not very popular. The Romans didn't really trust him, even though they appointed him, because he wasn't a Roman, and the Jews didn't trust him because he wasn't really Jewish either. So no one really liked him, but he was a great builder, and he served a purpose. Okay, so going back to the Great Revolt. So sorry, I'm talking for a really long time. This one has a lot of lecture in it. Any questions about what I've gone through? As I said, lots of history in a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to take you to a story in the Talmud. I haven't said what the Talmud is yet, but we will. And the story takes place as Jerusalem is about to fall in the year 70. The Romans are surrounding it with their army. It's clear that the walls are going to be breached, and that the city is going to fall. The temple is going to be destroyed. All the people in the city are going to be massacred. There are some people in the city who want to keep fighting till the bitter end, the zealots. There are some people in the city who want to lay down their arms, who want to give up, who want to beg for mercy, and try to prevent this massacre from taking place. And this is on the verge of the second exile. The first exile happened in 586, and we came back from it pretty quickly. But now it's about to happen all over again. And the figure that we're looking at is a man named Rabbi, one of the rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And the story in the Talmud is somewhat historical, somewhat fictional. It's a combination of things that, it's a fictional take on what happened in this particular time period. He is snuck out of Jerusalem by his students in a casket, in a coffin, pretending to be dead, and they're taking him out of the city to bury him. And somehow he winds up talking to the general who's leading the siege of Jerusalem, a man named Titus, who's going to go on to be an emperor of Rome. And however it is, he manages to impress Titus, and the emperor, or the general at that time, gives him one wish, like a genie. Anything you ask for, I'm going to give you. So if you're Rabbi Yochanan, what do you ask for at this moment? Well, that's the obvious answer. Okay, spare the city. 3 more wishes. Okay, I shouldn't have said the genie. Okay, the obvious one is to spare the city. But Rabbi Yochanan in this story is really thinking ahead. And he's held up, he's one of any number of leaders, but he's held up in this story as the person who realizes the same point that I've been saying in hindsight, that Israel is this tiny little land being passed around from empire to empire. And there's always a chance that the temple is going to be destroyed. Maybe it won't be destroyed today. Maybe it won't be destroyed next week. Maybe I'll get a reprieve. But in 3 months, the Zealots will launch another war. Rome is going to crack down again, and they'll burn the temple then. Or whatever empire comes next is going to take over from the Roman Empire, and they're going to destroy the temple. And so what could theoretically happen at this point if the temple is destroyed and the Jewish people go into exile again? Well, the Pharisees he's a Pharisee. He's a sort of a Pharisee. He's looking at the end of Judaism. He's looking at the end of the Jewish people. Yeah, we came back from one exile. We came back from the Babylonian exile with some amount of luck, some amount of effort to keep together as a people. But who knows if it's going to happen again? This time, Rome might massacre as many people as they can in the land of Israel. Next time, there might not be a Persian Empire who's going to allow the Jewish people to come back and rebuild. How many? Well, you don't know because you haven't heard of them, but there are any number of ancient religions based on some local shrine in the Middle East that disappeared that you have never heard of because when their shrine was destroyed, they just disappeared. And Rabbi Yochanan and his colleagues don't want that fate for the Jewish people, for their people, for us. Now, we're here, so we know that they figured out what to do. So Rabbi Yochanan, going back to that story, asks the general, not for Jerusalem, but he asks instead for the city of Yavne, another city in the land of Israel where the rabbis, where the Pharisees were more densely based, or that was one of their centers, one of their academies. And he asks him to spare that city and the sages in that city. So that's the way the story is described in the Talmud. And we know that Jewish leaders or leaders in the land of Israel did have contacts with Roman generals and Roman emperors, and they did know how to interact with them. So the story probably represents some kind of negotiation that was taking place between some Jewish leaders and Roman powers. That yes, they're going to destroy the land. Yes, they're going to really impose direct control on the land of Israel, but they'll leave the rabbis in charge of their particular area. And this is how, again, that group of formerly known as the Pharisees, now known as the rabbis, become the dominant group in the land of Israel and the dominant Jewish group. The temple is destroyed. We're still mourning it to this day. Even though we have a rebuilt state of Israel, we still fast on the day that the temple was destroyed, the 9th day of Av, which takes place usually in late July or August. It's the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. And there are still Jews who are praying, who really believe that the temple is going to be rebuilt, that there will be a third temple on that same spot in the middle of Jerusalem. But it hasn't happened for almost 2,000 years. So Rabbi Yochanan was very much right in that regard. And I don't really see it happening for the next 2,000 years either. But that's my particular approach. Now, Rabbi Yochanan and the rabbis, Pharisees, realized that Judaism needs to be reinvented, needs to change drastically if it's going to exist without a temple. Jews need to be able to practice Judaism in Charlotte, North Carolina, in Australia, anywhere in Israel, in London, in New York, anywhere where Jews are. They need to have a religion that goes with them. They need to have those distinct practices, those connections that maintain their particular Jewish identity. And before this time period, that was not necessarily going to happen because they were so closely linked to the land and to that temple. So this is why it's called a revolution, because it's a change in the entire focus of the religion. Now, it's very hard. Revolution implies a sudden change from what came before, an overthrow of what came before. It's not necessarily, in that regard, it's not necessarily a good word. So if I stood up on this chair or on box or whatever I'm going to stand on and said, God talked to me, and now God told me that now, starting today, you all have to do X, Y, and Z, and you're not allowed to do A, B, and C. How would people respond to that? They would rebel because you'd look like a crackpot, because you'd look crazy. So that's the problem that their rabbis have. They're basically, I don't want to say they're inventing a new religion, but they are reinventing a religion that didn't fully exist before. Because most of the rituals that we think of as Jewish rituals weren't being done during temple times. And they start to move, as the Pharisees did, move rituals out of the temple, that central shrine, one into synagogues, local temples, which is still how Jews take their religion with us, and perhaps more importantly, the practices that we do at home. This is the emphasis on Shabbat, emphasis on kashrut, emphasis on going to the mikveh, emphasis on the holidays that we celebrate outside of the temple, things like the Passover Seder, when you can't offer the sacrifice in Jerusalem anymore, as we talked about before Passover. Instead, you have a Passover Seder where you relive the experience. So the Jews are, am I doing on time? The Jews are exiled. They're spreading out throughout the Near East. And as they are spreading out, they realize something new. They're reinventing their traditions kind of on the spot. They're taking the Torah, these ancient laws, and applying them to their new situations that they're in. But as the communities spread out, there's no cohesion between them, and there's no way to teach people in the communities about how to live Jewish lives because they don't have access to some central rabbinical school or central organization that tells them what to do. And so Jewish leaders start to write new books. We're called the people of the book. We generally think that means the Torah, but we have any number of holy books. And the first book that is really important for the development of Judaism is called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is, if you look, this is written down in the course book. If you look on page 130, the Mishnah is a codification of Jewish law compiled about the year 200 in the land of Israel by a man named Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. Codification means to write something into a law code. So it's recording the practices that they had already. People could practice their. They knew what they did, and codification means when you actually write it down. Now, when you write something down, it does a few different things. It kind of stops the development of the practice. When something becomes written down instead of a kind of a practice that's passed on from generation to generation or from within families, there becomes an official way to do it. So codification is something like standardization, because also leads to standardization of practices. And the Mishnah is the first law code since the Torah that the Jewish people looked at. Now, the Torah, we know, is a mixture of stories and of laws. The Mishnah is entirely laws about the way that Jewish people are living during this time. Now, the rabbis who wrote this down, Rabbi Yehuda and his colleagues, referred to the Mishnah as the oral Torah. That's a term that is also on the top of the page, and it's in contrast to the written Torah. The written Torah is the 5 books of Moses that are old stories. The oral Torah starts with the Mishnah, and it's the explanation of those stories and explaining how to apply those laws. Because one of the most important things to know about Judaism is that if you look in the written Torah back there, you will not learn how to live a Jewish life. It's not enough. It's the beginning of Jewish practice, the beginning of Jewish life, but it doesn't describe what we do today. And in the most traditional way of looking at it, the oral Torah was given to Moses at Sinai together with the written Torah. That God gives Moses the 5 books, And the oral Torah is what God has taught Moses for the 40 days on Mount Sinai, both times that Moses goes up. And it's been passed down from Moses until this time period, until Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. He's just the first person to write it down. That's not exactly a historical statement, that's a religious statement, but it's the way that it's traditionally been looked at. When I say the oral Torah, theologically, to me that means the way that Jews practice the Torah. And we're going to see kind of what that means in a few minutes. So the Mishnah is compiled around the year 200, but it's not enough. It's the start of rabbinic literature, but Jews continue to debate all of the laws in the Mishnah, all of the practices, because we're good at that and we can agree on how to do anything. And the discussions of the Mishnah carry on for about 300 years in different Jewish communities, primarily the Jews who are left in the land of Israel, which by this point has been renamed by the Romans as Palestine, or the Greek version of Palestine. That's where the name Palestine comes from. It was the Roman name for the land of Israel. And also in Bavel, again in Babylonia. Those are the two major Jewish communities that are left. So around the year 500 of the Common Era, both communities, again, write down, codify is not the right word for this, but record their discussions of the Mishnah. And this is a book called the Gemara. The Gemara are discussions of the Mishnah, debates about the laws of the Mishnah. And when you put the Mishnah and Gemara together, you get the Talmud, which of those three, that's probably the most well-known phrase. So the Talmud includes really discussions of Jewish practice that start around the end of the Second Temple period and go till 500 of the Common Era. And the Talmud is not really one type of book. It's kind of a stream of conscious type writing. It's actually can be very frustrating to read if you don't know what you're looking at, because it has rabbis challenging other rabbis, discussions of laws, stories mixed in, philosophy, a little bit of everything. Half the debates aren't resolved in the Talmud, so it is, to me, I've enjoyed studying Talmud, and that's the prime subject that's studied in traditional yeshivas. But it is something that is very challenging to get into if you don't have a good introduction to it. Now, two main types of literature are found in the Talmud, and those are the last two terms on page 130. One are discussions of halakha. Halakha is translated as Jewish law. Literally, it means the way. Lalechet means to walk, so the way that you walk. Descriptions of how we live, or statements that this is how you are supposed to live. And the other type of literature that you will see is called Agadah, which are called legends, stories. And they complement each other. Both of those make up Jewish tradition and make up the Talmud. You can't really have one without the other. Why do people tell stories generally? What's that? They're anecdotal. They're also a way of teaching values, of teaching ideas without necessarily writing it down as you have to do this or you cannot do that. So we learn both from the halakha, from the things that are written out as law, and the things that are written out as stories. And what we're going to do with the rest of the time is actually take a look at an example of halakha, at how the rabbis use this topic of halakha to reframe the Torah, to take a Torah topic and something that's written in the Torah and adapt it. And we're going to look at one example of Agadah, Jewish legend. But let's take about a 3-minute break. Looks like Clara Rose's. Mhm. Yes, not there's a small group called the Samaritans. They still live in the West Bank, area, and they offer sacrifices. Yes, they say about Passover. Yes, but we are all conservative Orthodox. We're all descended from that group of Jews that wrote the Talmud, and so there are no people, very few people in the Jewish community who say that they don't follow the Talmud. They don't live by Talmud. I have a few hundred. Mhm. Okay, let's keep this going. So Ben asked, are there any Jews today who don't follow the Talmud, who say, I'm going to follow the laws of the Torah? And the answer is not really. Um, when we think of different denominations today, conservative, reform, orthodox, reconstructionist, uh, they all descended from rabbinic Jews, from the rabbis, from the Pharisees, from the people who wrote the Talmud. So we all trace our traditions back to that. We've diverged a lot in modern times from each other, but we all start the principle, we all start with the idea that the Talmud is kind of the cornerstone of Judaism. Raise your hand. So, okay, brought up an interesting question. The Karaites are a small group. They're a sect that developed around that same time, uh, also flourished in Egypt. They do not follow the Talmud. Now, the Karaites, I say this realizing that we have some people in the congregation who come from a Karaite tradition, who really are very interesting. But generally, most Karaite communities exist are distinct from quote unquote Jewish communities. There are not very many of them, but there are some in Israel. There's some in the United States, and generally they don't overlap with the Jewish community. Karaites, and they're a different sect, completely their own sect, their own particular sect. So, for example, now again, not about Karaites, but about in Talmudic Jews in general, the story of Hanukkah we talked about very briefly takes place after the end of the Torah. It takes place long after Moses died. So if you only followed the Torah, if you didn't follow the Talmud, you would have no idea that Hanukkah exists as a holiday. But every Jewish denomination celebrates Hanukkah because it's from the Talmud. So that's kind of an example of how they how we all trace our traditions to the Talmud. Yeah. So the Ethiopians, I'm not sure what their story is. I know there are a few different groups. There's one group that was part of a mass conversion to Judaism, and there's another group that I think trace their ancestry to the 10 lost tribes, which was way before, which was during the First Temple period. So they would not have been Talmudic Jews, and I think that they were they were converted en masse when they came to Israel. Um, but I think they have slightly different stories. So there are these splinter groups that might have been part of the Jewish world, really in this time period that we were talking about, or even before then, that haven't been part of kind of the mainstream Jewish community that we're part of today. And Ethiopians are a good example of that. But in Israel, they've very much become mainstreamed and become part of the Jewish world. Okay, so on page 131 is a page of Talmud. A typical page of Talmud looks like. There are 2,711 double-sided folios of Talmud, arranged into tractates, or in Hebrew, masechtot, describing these discussions. And this format for the Talmud came from the city of Vilna in the 1870s, and almost every edition of the Talmud is published to look like this. You can see some of the things on the page orient you, like the number bet in the upper left-hand corner is the page number. The section in the middle in the main text, that's the Talmud, that's the Mishnah and the Gemara. And on either side of it are commentaries, most notably the commentary of Rashi from 1100 of the Common Era, and the commentaries of Tosfot, Rashi's grandchildren and their contemporaries from about 100 plus to 300 years later. And this is the standard way that Talmud is studied in yeshivas and seminaries from a book that looks like this. We get to how we might study it today. But we're going to look at two sections of rabbinic literature. And first one is on page 132, and we're going to start with the text from the Torah that this is looking at. And this is an example of how the rabbis use halacha to take a text that I'm going to use the words challenging and try to make it a little bit more palatable to people who are reading it at a later time. And the section is from Dvarim, from Deuteronomy, chapter 21, and it's known as the Ben Sorer Umoreh, the rebellious son or the rebellious child. Jennifer, could you read this section from Dvarim, from Deuteronomy? Oh.
They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is wayward and defiant. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town shall stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear and be afraid.
Okay, so let's hear some reactions to that text. Laughing. Think about what you might do to you. What's that? You ruined my whole childhood. It's a pretty harsh sounding text. Basically, it's a very somewhat vague sounding story. Now, this is there in the Torah. We chant it every single year when we get to Dvarim. It's in Parshat Ki Tetzei. Have you ever seen a Jewish child get stoned by the village elders at the gate? No, you've never seen that. And you probably never, I hope you never will. So the question is, what do you do with a text like this? It's in a book that we consider sacred, we consider holy, we consider to come from God in some way, and yet it's a text that is, let's say, morally problematic. Is that a good description of it? We don't think that you should punish children for pretty much anything they do with capital punishment. Just a general rule of thumb. So what do we do with this text? So this text, the discussion of it starts in the Mishnah, in the tractate called Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is about judges, is about law codes, about Jewish civil law, not Jewish ritual law. Today we really only think about the ritual side of Jewish law. But in ancient times, Jewish law included many matters that we would call civil or criminal law. And this, usually would fit into one of those categories. Okay, so what the rabbis try to do is they do a very close reading of it, word by word, breaking it down, and basically they try to eliminate the text without getting rid of it, or make it impossible to follow without actually getting rid of the text. So, this Jennifer, could you pick up with the Mishnah, section number 1? Okay, so it's a strange phrase. Basically, when he hits puberty, is what it's going for. They say what age are they talking about? Are we talking about a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old? No, we're talking about a teenager. That's their way of describing it. And by the way, there was just a question about the language they use. When you think about bar mitzvah, standard ceremony that we do today, the way that bar mitzvah was determined originally was when a boy hit puberty. Now, boys who have bar mitzvahs either have or have not started puberty. It's a coin toss. And at a certain point, they realized it made more sense to set an age on it than try to make that determination. And but basically, they're saying that it applies to probably in his teenage years. Circumcised at 13. Generally, it's not attributed to that, but that might be a very early use of the number 13 to mean some kind of maturity, but it's possible. 13 was picked as the number when most boys have started to reach physical maturity. Okay, so keep going. So first, it's limiting the age or defining the age. Okay, so they're limiting who this talks about. So who have they ruled out by a close reading? So first of all, it doesn't apply to daughters. It only applies to boys. Um, they use the word ben, son, so they rule out minors. It has to be an adult, or 13 is the age of adult. Okay, Jennifer, keep going with number 2. Tartamar, some measurement. So now they're defining what it means when they say he's a glutton and a drunkard. Well, it means someone who consumes X amount of meat and drinks a certain amount of wine, which I presume is a lot. All right, keep going. Sorry, Harris, I said we weren't going to talk about drinking, but it looks like we got back there. Yes. So now they're limiting it. Okay, maybe he overindulges, but maybe it's a kiddush, and that's okay. Karen's laughing about that. So they're limiting they're limiting the application of it. Keep going. Okay, so it's limiting what it is that he does. So they're picturing someone who is, they describe it, a glutton and a drunkard, wild in some way, out of control. They focus on his consumption habits, but again, talking about something specific. It only applies. Now they limit the food based on their interpretation of the text. Ben Lappin, could you go with number 3? So again, now if he's gone from eating and drinking too much to stealing, they're limiting the applicability of it. It has to fall into this very particular case. Okay, keep going with number 4, Ben. Okay, so both parents have to be in on this. Can you go back to the text in the Torah and see where you think they interpret that from? Look at the words of the text in Deuteronomy and see what leads them to this interpretation. Let's go ahead. Yeah, so every time it lists his father and his mother shall take hold of him. So they're saying that both of them have to agree to this. It can't be one parent and not the other. Keep going, Ben. So I've always found this one to be a particularly interesting one. What do you think they're saying here? Why are they putting these qualifications on it? Well, probably, I always think it's the first one of those, that they're saying that, okay, he comes from a troubled house. Let's put it that way. Whether we would say something about that, whether we might say that today, I don't know. But they're again using the text to say there's a reason he turned out the way he did, and his parents can't now give their problem to somebody else. Okay, keep going, Ben. Keep going. So they put the legal procedure in place, and this Tractate Sanhedrin is very concerned with proper legal procedure. He has to be warned first by this court of 3, then judged again by this higher court of 23. So the Mishnah discusses it, and then over the few hundred years after that, the Talmud continues this discussion, and they play off of what it says in the Mishnah. So Ben Worth, could you pick up with the Gemara in Sanhedrin 71a?
Might mean that their relationship is in some way improper. However, at the end of the day, his parents are still his parents, so this probably isn't so. Rather, it must mean that his mother must be physically similar to her husband. Why? Because the Torah says he doesn't pay attention to our voice, singular, not plural. From this, we learn that they have similar voices, and it logically follows that they must have the same physical stature.
So this is a really strange sounding one. What are they doing here? They're playing in the Hebrew on the word. He doesn't listen to the voice of his father and his mother. Kol aviv v'kol imo. But basically, they're describing a situation that's very unlikely, that his parents have voices that sound remarkably similar. They are making this very hard to carry out, very hard to make it to actually do this mitzvah, this commandment to stone the child. And then they get to the second. Then they really get to the point of it. Keep going, Ben. Yeah, you got it. Ben Sorer Umore. So that's really the point of this whole thing. They have this text of the Torah that they are not following. They're not stoning their children for disobeying them. They're not, maybe that was a practice in the ancient Near East thousands of years before this took place, but it's not anymore. And they have to deal with this text there. So what do? They again limit the applicability, and basically they say it never happened because it's impossible for it to actually happen. Then there's one rabbi who objects and says, Rabbi Yonatan says, I once saw a stubborn and rebellious son, and I even sat on his grave. So one rabbi is causing trouble and not getting with the program there. But this is just a drastic example of what they are doing with a Torah text. That they're doing a very kind of hyper literal reading of the text to make it impossible to follow. It's a gruesome, it's a graphic text, and it's not really what we generally think of as halacha of Jewish law, but it's a good way to show how they looked at each individual word of the text for their particular goal. Now, the next text is actually one of the more inspiring texts, and it's an example of agadah, of legend, not halacha, and it comes from Tractate Bava Metzia, page 59b. And it's about a debate over an oven. We talked about ovens. We talked about whether they can be kosher or not, kosher, not kosher, pure, impure. And it's about some new type of oven. It's made out of layers of clay with sand in between the layers. And the rabbis are arguing about whether or not this oven can be made pure, can be kashered, so to speak, to use terms we would use today. And it's a debate between one rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, says that it can be, and the rest of the sages, all the other rabbis who say that it can't be. So, Bunny, would you take it away on this story? So Rabbi Eliezer is very persistent, and he's rationing all of his knowledge of Jewish law, of Jewish practice, to support his point. But the other rabbis are being stubborn. They're not accepting it. Okay, he gets a little frustrated, and he goes on. So he makes this statement that doesn't seem to have to do with anything. If I'm right, this carob tree is going to do something. And at that moment, the carob tree pulls itself out of the ground and jumps 100 yards in that direction. What is that supposed to mean? Who's Rabbi Eliezer invoking? God. He doesn't perform miracles. God performs miracles. He's saying, if I'm right, God's going to prove it. And God does. That should put an end to the argument. But okay, so they respond. This tree has nothing to do with our discussion. We're not going to accept your proof. But Rabbi Eliezer keeps going. Keep going. So miracle number 2 takes place. He says, the river will prove it. And all of a sudden, the river starts flowing the other direction. God is really persistent here. Again, they don't accept it. Keep going. Keep going.
Rabbi Joshua got to his feet and shouted, if sages are disputing a point of law, what business is it of yours? And the walls stopped collapsing in out of respect for Rabbi Joshua. But they didn't straighten either out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer.
So even the walls of the study hall are stuck in the middle of this fight, not sure who they're supposed to listen to. But the story is emphasizing that God seems to be weighing in multiple times. And if you're the rabbis, you should be listening to what God says. But no, they're not accepting it. They're not accepting what he says. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer pulls his last move. You skipped the line.
What are you arguing about? The law goes according to Rabbi Eliezer on all matters. Rabbi Joshua got to his feet and shouted, it is not in heaven. Rabbi Yirmiyah explains, Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. And from that point on, we don't rule according to divine voices. As it says, after the majority, you should incline.
Okay, so this was the crux of the story. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer implores God, don't send me a tree, don't send me a river. I want you to say exactly what's going on. And God does that. God speaks to the rabbis and says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And that should end the argument. But other rabbis, Rabbi Joshua, does the most chutzpahdik thing imaginable. What does he do? Not only does he go against the voice, how does he go against the voice? What does he do? Look at what he responded. Look at where it comes from. It's from the Torah. He takes a verse from the Torah, from what the book that they believe came from God, and throws it back at God. God is trying to tell him what to do, and Rabbi Joshua says, "No, you gave us this book, Torah, on Mount Sinai. Now it's up to us to follow it." And two of the things it says in that book is, one is it's not in heaven. Torah came down from heaven, was given to us. And the second thing is, also it says in Exodus, after the majority should incline. That you told us how to resolve cases. When there's a debate about Jewish law among scholars, it's decided here by the majority. Well, we've decided this. It doesn't matter that Rabbi Eliezer is right in some divine way. If the larger group hasn't accepted it, then it doesn't matter if he's right, because we're the ones who have to interpret the Torah. We're the ones who have to live with it. So it's both very chutzpahdik and also really very clever. Go ahead.
I find it disturbing because Rabbi Eliezer is saying that the law goes according to me, meaning him. It doesn't say according to God. And it makes Eliezer the end all and be all. And I've got a problem with that.
Well, Rabbi Eliezer was not known for his humility. But yeah,
Right,
but
no, okay,
yeah.
but
So you're right. You could read that into the story that for Rabbi Eliezer, there's a certain personal
he's taking credit
arrogance in
for
it.
He's not giving it to God.
Okay, so he's not giving it to God, even though God is supporting him. That's a
Right,
very
that's
interesting
where
point. That's an interesting point. What is he arguing for? Is he arguing for the sake of being right, or is he arguing for the sake of doing what God wants? Unclear. We could read him favorably. Okay, well, God tries to support him, but the other rabbis shoot him down. Now, there's a postscript to this story. Keep going. Sometime later.
Rabbi Nathan met Elijah the prophet and asked, "What was God doing at the time?" And Elijah replied, "The Holy One was laughing and saying, 'My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me.'"
So Rabbi Natan, who was there at the time of this argument, runs into Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, who's taking a break from visiting our seders and our brisses and our havdallas and all the other places where he gets to go and drink. And Elijah is the prophet who never died. He ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot and wanders the earth and wanders between heaven and earth. So Elijah is one of the ways that they believe that was their way of saying they had insight into what God is thinking. And so Rabbi Nathan asks him, what's going on as God is up there in heaven trying to weigh in on this debate, and the rabbis are throwing God's words back at him. God's reaction is laughing about it, and God is joyful that my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. What do you think that sentence means? My children have defeated me.
I don't know. It's genuine, but maybe not.
It's they've outsmarted me. They took what I taught them and they used it to best me. And he's proud. God seems to be proud of that. That's what the laughing. It's not that God is upset, but that God is proud that the children are doing exactly what God taught them to do. Now go ahead.
So is he really defending Rabbi Eliezer, or is he encouraging all the other sages?
It sounds like ultimately he's encouraging all the other sages. He's saying, if you want to know the ultimate answer, what I think about the subject, Rabbi Eliezer is right. But it doesn't matter. It does, as long as we discuss it, as long as this is the conclusion that is reached by the majority here. So that's a process for making a decision. Whether it's a good process or not, you can debate, but it's process and it's a process and they're following it and they're sticking to it. Now this text, as I said, it's an Agadah. It's an example of a legend. What do you think of the values that it's trying to teach?
God basically is saying that they should work together because majority.
Okay, there's some amount of working together that's part of it. So it's basically changing the way that Judaism functions from the biblical time when God would speak to the people on a mountain or would speak to Abraham or would tell Moses what to tell the people, that God is going to give you all the answers because God doesn't speak to us today in that way. Rather, God speaks to us by giving us this system that we interpret. And now discerning God's will is up to us based on the system, the books, the texts that God gave us. There was a quote by one of the professors at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the early 20th century, and I've heard it attributed to multiple people from that period, so I don't know who it's from. But the quote went something like this: "When I pray, I talk to God. When I study, God talks to me." What do you think that means? All right, so what's the output? What's the input? Yeah. Mhm. So praying is what we do all the time as Jews. We talk to God, whether we're using the words of the Siddur or using our own words. We're always talking to God. But God doesn't answer the way that God answered Moses. So how do we know what God is saying? It's for him, it was through study of sacred texts. He understands God's will through looking at the texts of the Torah, the Mishnah, the Gemara, other texts, and learning what God expects of him. And that's kind of been the general mindset of how we learn God's will, by looking at our sacred texts, at the Torah, at the Mishnah, at the Talmud, and then later law codes developed, which is actually the subject of the class that I was going to teach tonight. Yes. This is pretty.
This is it right here.
Yeah, that's a that's a great example of it. I would say question God, or is it debate what God's words mean? Yeah, I would go with ask. I would probably go with ask question. I mean, I shouldn't say it. Yes, we can certainly question God. I think that they're not disagreeing on the idea that that there's an idea of pure or impure. They're arguing about how to define it. So those were just two small Talmudic examples from the over 2,000 pages of discussion in the Talmud. The second story is actually taught fairly often because it's a really great story. First story, the first section, the halacha, a little less common. Now, for centuries, Talmud, Mishnah and Gemara, was studied by scholars in yeshiva. As I said, it's very esoteric. It's very hard to get into, but it's also the basis of Jewish practice. The way that we keep kosher, the way that we observe holidays, the way that we observe Shabbat, all of those can be found in the Talmud, or at least start in the Talmud, more so than in the Torah. But for most of Jewish history, this wasn't accessible to most people. Well, in the late 1800s, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi came up with the idea of something called Daf Yomi. Daf is the page, Yomi is daily, a day, a page a day, or the daily page. And his idea was that a Jewish person should study one page of Talmud each day and complete the study of the Talmud in about 7.5 years. He started it with a small group of people. And he taught that this was a way into studying Talmud for people who were lay people, not scholars. They didn't study it in the same depth as people in yeshiva, but they would go through one page a day, and the consistency, they would have breadth of knowledge. You don't pick up anything. Daf Yomi has actually grown, and it is actually a rather large practice in the Jewish world today, mostly in the ultra-Orthodox world, the Orthodox world, but more so the last two cycles of Daf Yomi in the non-Orthodox world as well. Men and women who want to study a page of Gemara each and every day. And it's really very challenging to do. But if you're, like, for example, if you take the Long Island Railroad to get into the city for work in the morning, if people are still doing that, there is a Talmud group that meets on the multiple Talmud groups that meet on the LIRR every day to study. Right now, there are multiple podcasts, many podcasts that come out every day that discuss one page of Talmud a day. And it's really a very interesting practice. I tried it a cycle and a half ago to get it started, and the problem is once you fall behind, you're in real trouble. Because it's really hard to catch up. And actually, the best advice I heard from someone who's doing it is that you really shouldn't try to catch up. You should just pick up where you on the day that you're up to, and skip the rest of the stuff and worry about the next cycle. But every 7.5 years, there's a celebration across the Jewish world called a siyum, a completion of study. And the biggest one usually takes place at one of the stadiums in the New York area, filled with Jews who are celebrating the completion of study of the entire Talmud. And it is a remarkable achievement and a remarkable commitment to do that every single day, to study a page of Talmud. And what I printed out for you was from Alana Kirshan. She wrote a book actually about studying Daf Yomi. It was part of her memoir, and it was very interesting. And I just shared this with you to look at 9 things to know about the Daf Yomi, the daily page of Talmud. And it's I'm sorry, I said 1923 that Rabbi Meir Shapiro came up with the idea for Daf Yomi. But it's worth reading and seeing it. And if you, I see she listed on here. It doesn't list, but you can certainly find, like, if you look online and find some of the Daf Yomi podcasts or the daily pages that are put out, it's just interesting to see how people are studying Talmud today, that it's something that you think of as very distant, very removed, and sometimes it is. Sometimes texts are very hard to relate to, and sometimes they're very enjoyable and very interesting and very meaningful. So that was a lot of Jewish history in an hour and a half, and an introduction to rabbinic literature and to the rabbinic way of looking at Judaism. Takeaways, I would say, from the class is remembering that we are actually all rabbinic Jews. We're all Talmudic Jews, and that many of our traditions start in the Torah, but are developed by the generations of Jews who wrote the Talmud and the generations after that who continued to interpret it. Next week, I'm going to hand you back off to Rabbi Kornsgold. Thank you all.
Thank you. You know, what I really like was the CRK of both